Are we on? All right. Let's begin with prayer this morning. Our gracious Heavenly Father, we're very grateful that we have your word. We have your word in our own language so that we can read it for ourselves, read it publicly with understanding, that we can set apart men to explain the meaning of the text and give your word to your people for their enrichment. For we know that we do not live by bread alone, but we do live on every word that proceeds from your mouth. And thus, as we continue to look into your word and your plan of redemption and how it all leads us to the person and work of our Lord Jesus Christ, we do pray for your blessing upon us as we contemplate these things together, and we do pray that you would enrich us in our knowledge of him. We ask this through Christ. Amen.
Hey, before you begin,
Yeah.
would you be open to just giving us a little thumbnail of your trip?
Oh, I was thinking about doing that. I was at the Society of Biblical Literature over last weekend. There are some meetings on Friday night for an organization, a conservative organization that I didn't manage to get to because of my flight. This year I didn't find the actual conferences. There's hundreds of units, many of them specialty units, some of them more broad. I didn't find any of them particularly interesting this year. There was one on Galatians that's been an ongoing conference, and it is an evangelical interest in Galatians. They were talking about a lot of the things that we discussed in our own Galatians study, which made me feel good. Especially, they're now in this group investigating further the Ezekiel 36 through 38 background, which, of course, we talked about, and the role of the eschatological spirit, and that was interesting, and all the participants were conservative. Other than that, I was a little disappointed in most of the meetings that I attended.
Did you see anybody?
I sat next to Gerald Bray, the theologian. He's a historical theologian, and I overheard him talking to someone about doing a teaching period in a South African college or seminary. But the overall experience, the time away, I got deeply involved in Linda Roper's fairly new biography of Martin Luther. Marcia came for a little bit, so we had some time together. They have a book table room that's absolutely enormous. All sorts of publishers represented there. What it does amaze me is when I entered Bible college in the mid-'80s, the choices for good theological material were extraordinarily limited. And now there's been such an incredible growth in evangelical conservative scholarship. And I'm using evangelical here in the sense of a belief in the inspiration and integrity and reliability of Scripture. That, Baker and Baylor, Zondervan, IVP, academic, even Erdman's now is kind of off to the side a little bit. Whiffenstock, there's just an incredible bounty of books out there. Maybe too many, actually, because I came across like 3 or 4 new Romans commentaries, and I'll flip open, look at certain passages that I might be familiar with, and think to myself, you're not saying anything new yet. Maybe we need to give this some time, let this generation's reflections on Romans settle a little bit, invest somewhere else for a while, and then come back to it. So, but that's always a lot of fun, and I bought 2 commentaries on 1 Peter and a book by John Walton on the Torah.
Why would you buy 2 commentaries on 1 Peter when you've already preached through 1 Peter?
Because I think I'm going to preach through it again. We rehearsed that.
The gasp goes through the
But, what's interesting is I first started working on 1 Peter in Edinburgh, and that was it'll be 30 years ago. So how do it's sort of interesting to come back to a book with 30 years of life experience behind you, behind me in this case, and revisit it with more mature eyes. And I'm sort of interested in that. So it certainly won't be re-preaching 30-year-old sermons. Just see what's been said about it since then. So it's good. I should say too that this is the never-ending story of the already not yet. And once again, if one visits a conference that's scholarly in its orientation about the Bible, what I'm talking about in the already not yet isn't even a matter of debate. It's just settled. Everybody knows this now. You can be Anglican, you can be Lutheran, you can be Presbyterian. If you're this is not going to sound good, if you're a thinking Baptist, if you're Pentecostal, if you're a thinking Pentecostal, and I used to be a Pentecostal, this is just now the only conservative group that doesn't really embrace this, of course, are the dispensationalists. And the neo-dispensationalists have come a long way, I think, in our direction. And I was thinking about this morning, the new Calvinist movement, 9 Marks, John Piper, I think they dumped Together for the Gospel. Do you know, did that come to an end?
Yes.
Yeah. Together for the Cash. That was another neo. All they did was they resurrected the 5 points of Calvinism. So they didn't bring the quality of eschatological scholarship that was introduced by Voss to the world. What they did was repackage Calvinism. And part of my frustration with that movement is it's not Calvin and it's not eschatological. So it's just the sovereignty of God.
It is.
It's not even the gospel. The gospel as defined by the Bible itself, it is not that. It's received a lot of criticism for its celebrity orientation, and I think it's deserved that criticism, and it's a huge disappointment to me. I guess, what's his name, the goofy guy from Seattle, was in it, and then he got bounced, and other people. Yes. Yeah. It's very frustrating. I hate Calvin's name is dragged through the mud enough without people embracing it and not properly representing his theology, and then leaving off this it's just wonderful development in New Testament scholarship that's now if you go to Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia, the seminary for the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, there's not going to be a man on the faculty who does not believe in what I'm teaching here with the already not yet. They might not, there are different ways of crossing T's and dotting I's. If you go to Reformed Theological Seminary in Jackson, same thing. If you go to Gordon Conwell, it's just standard now. And these men had such positions of prominence and yet failed to deliver in this crucial matter of understanding the work of Christ, to me is, it's a delinquency, actually. It's ministerial delinquency. So, yeah. Anything else about my trip or?
What did you think was lacking at the conference that made you disappointed? What was different?
If you think of it in terms of a conference, it's sort of the wrong image, because what it is a collection of hundreds of small meetings devoted to various scholarly topics, most of which are presented by specialists, right? So the first time I went to SBL, I went because my friend and colleague at Whitfield Academy was actually presenting a paper. And I went to sort of lend him some support, and then I thought, this is really kind of exciting, and found some great meetings to go to. And plus, I, of course, attended his meeting. And Marcia asked me, well, how many people were there? This is for Matt McIntosh. Some of you know that name. And I thought maybe 10 to 20, which sounds a little bit disappointing, but he was speaking on the topic of on scribal freedom among the Dead Sea Scrolls copyists. Well, that's a specialist topic, right? So the people who were there are interested in the textual transmission of the Dead Sea Scrolls. How many of you have been reading on that lately?
Was that his dissertation?
Yes. And so that's what it's like. There's a Deuteronomy section. There's a Pauline letters section. There is the which they separate from the disputed Paulines. There's the wisdom. There's the queer interpretation of thus and so, all over the map. But the book I get is like that thick. So it's really discrete meetings of specialists, but in that context you can find some really good stuff. And this year I think I mostly whiffed on that.
BTS was there at the same time?
They always meet the week prior to SBL's weekend in the same city. I may do that one year instead, if they'll have me.
It's a lot smaller.
Oh, yeah. No, this is attended by, there are Jewish scholars there are African scholars, German scholars, Catholic priests dressed in monkish garments, so it's broad as can be. But in the broadness, there's often very good conversation. Yeah, I went to hear a rabbi one year on the ministry of Jesus. It was fascinating. So, speaking of which, we're looking at how the Old Testament mediatorial offices fancy way of saying prophet, priest, and king, which are so prominent in Israel's national life, may, at least in part, give us an indication of what will develop into Paul's doctrine of union with Christ. Okay, so this is where we started, and I'm not going to do a lengthy sub-series on this, but it's mostly the suggestion of it with representative passages. It's even in our catechism that Jesus holds these three offices in the church: prophet, priest, and king. And when we take a closer look at Israel's story, we notice that there is an unmistakable relationship that each of these offices, or each officer holding an office, has with the people and with Yahweh. Thus, the idea of mediatorial office, right? And I remember being struck by this passage when we did the Hebrews Bible study. Hebrews 5, 1 through 3. For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God. So there's the mediatorial dimension. To offer gifts and sacrifices for sin. He can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. Because of this, he is obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins, just as he does for those of the people. And so the priestly mediator is not an impartial third party who steps in to engage in temple worship as sort of a disinterested and objective officer. That's what we think of as a mediator. A mediator, by definition, has to be a disinterested party, right? At least in legal disputes. Rather, he has a personal stake in the service. And while he must, above everything else, love and obey Yahweh as his first loyalty, it is Yahweh himself who appoints him to the office, separating him for this office and for the sake of Yahweh's own sinful people. And so there's a connectedness there which gives a kind of sense of unity, I think, between the representative and those whom he represents. He is one of the people that's set apart for a sacred task, but he's part of his qualification for that to represent the people in the very presence of God is because he identifies with them in their weakness. Okay? So, and of course, you know, who's the exemplar in this respect? Did I do him already? I think I did. I get lost in my... It's Moses, of course, right? Who functions in a priestly way, in part. And his life is ruined because he's stuck between his loyalty to Yahweh and his love for and identification with Yahweh's people. And the relationship between Moses and Yahweh sometimes confounds readers of the Bible because God seems like a partner in the relationship and not like the sovereign, omniscient God, right, of at least some presentations of systematic theology. He gets God to change his mind in his mediatorial work. And that, I think, is already an indication, not that God changes his mind, right? But it's a window into what will become the mediatorial work of Jesus. To identify deeply with the people, to rise up from among them, but to be primarily focused on God's interest and then holding the two together, the people and God. So, this same idea can be found in other notable Old Testament figures who serve as prophets and or priests, including what I'll call the chapter 9 men. The chapter 9 men are Daniel, Ezra, and Nehemiah. You know why I call them the chapter 9 men? Because if you read all three of those books, in each one, chapter 9 is a record of their intercessory prayer. So I'm going to give a snippet from Daniel's, but this is representative of all of them. Daniel 9, 4 through 8. I prayed to Yahweh my God and made confession, saying, Lord, the great and awesome God, who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments, we have sinned and done wrong and acted wickedly and rebelled, turning aside from your commandments and rules. We have not listened to your servants, the prophets, who spoke in your name to our kings, our princes, and our fathers, and to all the people of the land. To you, O Lord, belongs righteousness, but to us open shame, as at this day to the men of Judah, to the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and to all Israel, those who are near and those who are far away, in all the lands to which you have driven them, because of the treachery that they have committed against you. To us, Yahweh, belongs open shame, to our kings, to our princes, and to our fathers, because we have sinned against you. Ezra 9, 5 through 11. And at the evening sacrifice I rose from my fasting with my garment and my cloak torn, and fell upon my knees and spread out my hands to Yahweh my God, saying, O my God, I am ashamed and blush to lift my face to you, my God, for our iniquities have risen higher than our heads, and our guilt is mounted up to the heavens. From the days of our fathers to this day, we have been in great guilt. And for our iniquities, we, our kings and our priests, have been given into the hand of the kings of the lands, to the sword, to captivity, to plundering, and to utter shame, as it is today. But now, for a brief moment, favor has been shown by Yahweh our God to leave us a remnant and to give us a secure hold within his holy place, that our God may brighten our eyes and grant us a little reviving in our slavery. But as extended, for we are slaves, yet our God has not forsaken us in our slavery, but has extended to us his steadfast love before the kings of Persia, etc. Now, O our God, what shall we say after this? For we have forsaken your commandments, which you commanded by your servants the prophets, saying, the land that you are entering to take possession of it is a land impure with the impurity of the peoples of the lands, with their abominations that have filled it from end to end with their uncleanness. And we could keep going. We could visit Ezra and get the same idea. But did anything strike you in both of those prayers or the snippets of the prayers? It's very subtle, but it's important.
They go back over the history.
Always, yes. You find that everywhere in the Old Testament. Let's bring the story up to date. And it's never a good one. But Israel never learns from its failure. But it's sitting there in plain sight, but you could barely notice it. We have sinned. I am ashamed. And you want to say, Ezra, you're a pretty good guy. I mean, you're doing what's right. Daniel's holiness is exemplary. He's going to keep a kosher kitchen even during the exile, and he's not going to eat what everybody else is eating, and he goes into the lion's den, trusting in God. But the prophets are so identified with the people that the only natural way to express that in prayer is with the first person plural. There's always a we involved, even when there is a you from the prophets. There's always this sense of we, where we are one grand people. You know that the rabbis taught that all of Israel was present at Mount Sinai, even if you lived long after the events at Mount Sinai. That's not necessary. We don't say to ourselves, we were all in Philadelphia in July of 1776. We honor the memory, we honor the event, but we would never think that our corporate unity was such that it was sort of retroactive back to the founding of the country. But this is how one thinks within the context of Israel. So the I is always one part of a whole. The I is always part of the we. So you won't hear mediators praying, God, I thank you that I am not like other men. So the prophets can get pretty mean, chastising, mocking, and threatening the people with awful judgments. At the same time, their hearts are all torn up for their own people. And no one epitomizes that more than Jeremiah, right? Who basically wishes he'd never been born, who wishes he could have an escape to his cottage off in the desert and just get away from everybody. So there's no arrogance in any of this. There is open identification. Yeah, and this is where I mentioned Moses. He is the mediator par excellence, who more than anyone represents Jesus typologically. I used to tell my students this. I was telling Phil Ledgerwood, who used to attend this church many years ago, that I was listening to the Bible Answer Man on the radio. So it tells you how far I haven't listened to the radio in I don't know how long. And his teaching that night was 9 steps to intimacy with God based on the life of Moses, which of course has nothing to do with the actual biblical story. So Phil wrote back to me and he said, step 1, become the mediator of a covenant. And I love that joke because it's exactly right. We just make Moses another guy. And of course, he is a man like us and worthy of imitation in our prayer, just as Elijah is, so says James. But by reducing him to just sort of one more Christian, we basically pull the rug out from under the whole story and his unique, divinely appointed role in redemptive history. He's the mediator of a covenant. That's not typical. That's a very rare privilege indeed, and it always involves suffering. So it's Israel's peculiar relationship to Moses that stands behind Paul's remark in 1 Corinthians 10, which connects water baptism with the Red Sea. But more interestingly here, especially in light of Paul's theology of baptism and union with Christ, the people become united to their leader in baptism, to their covenant mediator. For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses. Kai pontes eistan Mousein e baptis Thisan. They were baptized into Moses. That's language that we typically associate with Jesus, being baptized into him. So this is what I meant when I introduced this subsection, that if we can enter into Israel's conceptual world, and you know what that means, right? I'll tell a little Bob Galt story. It's a simple one, right? Years and years ago, this must go back to the 90s, we did a men's night out, and we went to see the movie Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and had dinner. Yeah. Bob came out and said he didn't like it because no one can fly, and people fly. Okay, fair enough.
How do you remember this? I don't remember too.
Because of the story. And what I said was, to enjoy it, you have to enter into the conceptual world of Chinese martial arts and the mythology that surrounds it. Just like you have to enter into the world of the American Western, right? It plays by its own rules. If you know the rules and enter into the experience, then you can enjoy it. But if you stand on the outside and say, there can't be any such thing as Death Stars, right? Or there are no elves, so what's this Lord of the Rings stuff? In other words, you enter in and accept the premises of the conceptual world in order to experience the entertainment fully. How much more so when it's the actual history of redemption and Israel's conceptual world, which was one more way of preparing all the world for the Lord Jesus Christ, right? He emerges from an existing world that is not just text, though it very much is that, but it's also a world of symbolism, of beliefs, of, and I say this respectfully, mythology, right? Gods live on top of mountains and that sort of thing, of temples. All of this comes to us from Israel in the Old Testament record. And so rather than insist that it come over to us and play by our rules, which is what Reformed theology has done with the Torah, okay, well, that's the ceremonial bit, and that's just for the civil authorities, and that's the moral bit right there. No, it's an entire world that we inherit and then enter into and explore for ourselves in order to better appreciate the work of our Redeemer, right? So these things give us more insight. And the union between the people and their mediatorial officers comes to its fullest expression, I think, in the relationship between the king and his people, and even the land that they inhabit together. And this brings me to another story. Many years ago, I saw a movie about King Arthur. And as the story unfolds, it was John Boorman's film Excalibur. I can't recommend it because I saw it a long time ago, but it has a couple of, it's violent and a couple of maybe semi-raunchy scenes, I guess. I would never watch it today. Anyways, the story unfolds, the king and his kingdom deteriorate. Notice I said the king and his kingdom deteriorate after a series of events that are traceable back to Lancelot and Guinevere's betrayal of Arthur. And in the movie, Arthur discovers the betrayal and takes his sword Excalibur and drives it into the ground, and this sets off a series of events that brings the land into blight and famine. So, to restore all that has been lost, Arthur's trusted knights embark on a search for the Holy Grail, which, if I remember correctly, is perilous for each knight in their separate quests, and some of them die. But Percival finally finds the Grail. And it's a very, stylistic scene. He's almost in a dream state, and he enters into the presence of the Grail, and the Grail speaks to him mystically. And the Grail says, "What is the secret of the Grail? Who does it serve?" And Percival says, "You, my Lord." I actually looked up the dialogue. And the Grail says, "Who am I?" And Percival says, "You are my Lord and King. You are Arthur." The Grail says, and at this point in the scene, the Grail kind of goes into soft focus, and Arthur is behind it and comes into sharp focus. So you get the idea that there's an exchange to reaffirm the dialogue. The Grail says, "Have you found the secret that I have lost?" And Percival says, "Yes, you and the land are one." Arthur and the land are identical. And with the Grail's secret revealed, Percival now takes it. He takes the cup, right? If you don't know what the Holy Grail is, it's the cup that was used at the Last Supper. He takes the cup to Arthur, who's lying in bed, who's obviously ill, and he holds the Grail to Arthur's lips and says to Arthur, "You and the land are one. Drink." And Arthur says, "I am wasting away. I cannot die and I cannot live." And Percival says, "Drink from the chalice. You will be reborn and the land with you." And I mean, it's just so really cool. If you enter into the conceptual world of this story, so that once he drinks from the Grail, Arthur and the land both are revived. He rallies his remaining knights for one last battle against the evil forces that have brought ruin to the land, and then he dies victorious. And there's a great scene. They're, slashing away in medieval fashion, and the evil powers are triumphing, and who rides in at the last minute but exiled Lancelot, who now looks, he's all hairy and he's lost his knightly glamour, but he comes in at the last moment and fights by Arthur's side, and they win the day. Lancelot dies, and the kingdom is saved, and Arthur's, sent out on the boat for the burial, those burning boats, and then they put the Excalibur goes back to the Lady of the Lake. And this is all so much fun. And in many respects, the biblical accounts of Israel's kings are like that. They aren't simply stories of historical figures who happen to be the king over a kingdom, though they are that, but they're stories that are almost Shakespearean, in their drama, in the court intrigue, and the tensions that often arise between the three offices of prophet, priest, and king. There are bloody battles to be fought in one. There are prophecies about the future. There's glory and there's disgrace. And in all of those stories, one sees a close connection between any individual king and the people he rules over. And it becomes, through the repetition in the stories, unmistakable. So that as it goes for the king, so it goes for the people. So in the early chapters of the Bible, we're focused on just a handful of men and their families. And that develops over time, and then of course they become a nation, and there's the Exodus and the conquest. By the time we get to the monarchy, the stories are almost exclusively about the kings, and whether they are good kings or bad kings. And the good kings bring righteousness to the entire land. even if the chronicler can list some of their oversights and errors. Nevertheless, the overall tone is this was a time of obedience, of true worship, and of Yahweh's blessing. All the northern kings, of course, are scoundrels, and they're all bad, and they wind up in exile long before the southern kingdom, right? So there's all of this going on, and if you enter into their world, you see this union between king and people that I think is unmistakable. And perhaps the most famous story, and we might not do the whole story. I'll introduce it though. The most famous among the stories that kind of captures this sacred bond is one that has suffered through all sorts of bad interpretations, silly distortions, which have effectively ruined the story as it was intended. And it's the account of David and Goliath, right? Which, gets buried under who knows how many sermons about facing giants in our lives, or the 5 smooth stones are prayer, fasting, Bible reading. My first year as a teacher in Whitfield, I told one of my classes that this was nonsense and it misses the point of the story. And one of the students, pastor, had written a short book on David and Goliath. So we went and looked at it. And sure enough, the 5 smooth stones weren't smooth stones that were useful for sending rockets at Goliath's head. They were prayer, fasting, daily Bible reading. And if there were 6 things for devotional practices, what would you do? You have to, and it's like, the early church fathers would be embarrassed to do that kind of allegorizing. And yet, because churches are conscientious that they are audience driven, I have to make the biblical material about you instead of about the heroes in the story, even though every other hero in our world is understood to be a separate hero who functions for the advantage of the masses. And so it is with David, right? And if you take the story on its own terms, it's a magnificent story. And I'll close with this, and then next time we'll just go through it briefly. But when I went to see Excalibur, I went with friends. We didn't come out of the movie and say to ourselves, we all need holy grails, don't we? When we're sick and facing struggles. No one would think that way, but we treat the Bible that way, and thus we end up subverting the story and missing what's so precious. That David represents his people and thus functions like a true king. And he defeats God's enemies on their behalf. So that the rest of us, the people here at Park Woods, we're just the Israelites waiting for someone to come forward and take on Goliath. That's all we are. And if someone does and wins, then what happens to us? We are not enslaved anymore to the evil powers. Isn't that a much better story than giants in our lives? It's a much better story. So if anyone gives you, hey, you need to listen to this, it's about the giants in our lives, just kick them in the knee and tell them that my pastor said to do that. So, all right, anything else before we close?
I was thinking when you were talking about all of Israel was represented at Mount Sinai, made me think of when Paul said the Levites were still in the body of Abraham.
Absolutely.
And it made me think...
That's actually Hebrews.
Okay.
Yeah.
It made me think that there's a whole concept here that's hardly talked about, or we haven't even scratched the surface of that representative, I'll use the term patriarchy, federal headship kind of a thing.
Right. And if we enter the biblical story and accept it on its terms, we will. But when we covered that passage in the Hebrew study, I said that if I did what the author of Hebrews has done with an Old Testament text, I would have gotten an F, right? Melchizedek has no lineage. He's eternal in that sense. He just appears and disappears. And the language of the one serving the other because Levite is subordinate to Melchizedek because he's a genetic descendant of Abraham. So, I can either say with my enlightened mind, capital E, that doesn't make any sense, or I can accept this interpretation by an inspired apostle or apostolic associate and realize that there's something going on in the story I might not have gotten had I been reading it on my own terms. Yeah, that's right. That's a perfect example. All right. All right, let's prepare for worship.